We have some of the regulars at the Billner Center are on leave or on vacation, so we did not have time to organize this a full way we do it every time, most of the time, but we apologize to you for that reason. But it's going to be fine. We're going to have a great discussion on the Amazon Basin. We are going to, I have my own set of short presentations. Some of you may have seen part of that on Brazil. And we'll do that at the end if there is time. But the main part of the presentation is going to be Tom Rudel's on the broader work he has done on the Amazon, includes particularly on the Ecuador, but also applying to Brazil. Tom is a very distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University. He's in sociology and human ecology, correct?
That's right. That's impressive.
And he has been studying the Amazon empirically for many, many years, just like you. You did spend some time there, right? Tom, once, when I was at Rutgers, I remember him coming back from Ecuador, from the jungle, with a virus that lasted 2 years, knocked him out for 2 years. Well, that's called the price you have to pay for becoming an expert in areas that are remote to many of us. And things like that do happen, but he remained faithful to the subject. And today's presentation benefits, draws from a lot of years, right?
Right.
Of research and field work. So Tom, when are you going to start?
Well, first of all, thanks to Mauricio and the Billner Center for
You have to use the microphone. This is a very strange
inviting me and letting me sort of spew forth or summarize a set of findings about what are sometimes referred to as populous frontiers in both Brazilian Amazon, but also in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And by that I mean a setting where you've got lots of smallholders, oftentimes mestizos, intermingled with Amerindian or indigenous peoples, and a relative absence of the corporate presence, which you might find, for instance, in a Brazilian frontier where soy predominates. So, for instance, in Mato Grosso. So, in the setting I'm going to be talking about today in Ecuador, most resembles Rondônia or Acre in Brazil, where you've got, again, a fairly large population of smallholders and indigenous folks as well. So with that as sort of let me sort of pose the question initially about a set of developments occurring in the landscapes of these populous, already settled areas that may be conceivably important in terms of policymaking in the next couple of decades. So let's see here. So a couple of questions about why this particular issue is important. One is that sustainable agricultural development, in this case silvopastures, could be a considerable carbon sink, meaning a setting where you could see negative, what's oftentimes referred to now as negative emissions. In other words, CO2 being absorbed from the atmosphere into the vegetation, and in so doing, you get a lowering of the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. That kind of development could end up being a high priority situation as the movement to control climate change gathers force. In populous frontiers, there is a poverty alleviation question that's particularly tied to Amerindian populations and their fortunes, how they fare as these frontiers become more settled. And we'll be referring to that in a little bit. And finally, these already settled areas bulk large globally. In other words, we're talking about already settled areas of the tropical biome, and that's a very considerable area. Let me just show you a map that gets at the extent of already deforested, settled parts of the tropical biome. So you can see here, those light green areas are already largely deforested parts of the tropical biome. The lighter areas are all largely deforested areas. The dark green areas are areas where primary rainforest predominates. So about 50% of the tropical biome consists of already cleared areas globally. And so then the question is, are there patterns of change in the development of these landscapes in the already settled areas that have significance for sustainable development? In other words, that show a trajectory that could conceivably be turned to some sort of advantage both locally and globally. And so that's the question I want to try to address, and I want to try to address it by means of looking fairly intensely at one case of a populous frontier in southeastern Ecuador. So you'll see here a map with the particular site of the case of a set of case studies that I'm going to refer to. So it's at the base of the Andes in southeastern Ecuador, near the city of Macas, or the town of Macas. Okay, and if you just look at that map, you can see where the Andes are running north-south, and the Amazon Basin's beginning and stretching eastward from the Andes. And it's the base of the Andes, that's the site for most of the research that I'm going to report on. Okay, this is a spectacular place when it's not covered by clouds, it's almost always covered by clouds. So one often doesn't see it, but the wall of the Andes rises, in this case, about 14,000 feet from the tropical base of the mountains. So it's really, it's breathtaking when you see it all. Most of the time, again, you do not see it because of the intense humid conditions. This area at the base of the Andes was a destination for migration. So much like the history of Rondônia, this area saw an influx of immigrants, in this case, immigrants from the Andean highlands. And so what you've got here is a shot of a sending region, the landscapes in the sending region in the mid-20th century. So it's a thickly settled area, drought-prone, also an area with very high levels of poverty. So if you're thinking analogously in terms of Brazil, think of migrants to Rondônia from the state of Sao Paulo or other parts of the South in the 1970s and 80s. So very high levels of poverty in these sending regions. The other thing to recognize about this migratory movement is that oftentimes, at least until about the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, it was powered by mules. In other words, the primary means by which migrants made their way down into this zone was via trails. There were no roads, there were very few airports, and it was only in the 60s that, and through the 1980s that this area became connected to a larger grid of roads in Ecuador. So just to give you, again, a sense of the landscape, here what you're doing is basically looking uphill, looking west, up into the Andes from the base of the Andes. Now pivot, and you're looking east here. This is out into the Amazon Basin. This is before the primary surge of settlement. These pictures were taken in the late 1960s. Okay, the landscape is a luxuriant, waterlogged one. So if we were standing, all of us, in this particular pasture, which is fully grown, ready to be harvested, probably only the tallest of us would actually stand above the grass. Just to give you a sense for how luxuriant this landscape is. And it's because it rains a lot. And what that implies, amongst other things, is that things happen to pastures in this sort of setting, things that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. Okay, it's a very difficult region to get around, and in part that's because rivers in this area, in this part of the Amazon Basin, are not avenues of communication, rather they are significant barriers to any kind of travel. If you look closely at this particular riverbed, you can see that it's got a big beach, playa, and there are streams running down that beach, and they move very quickly. So getting across this particular river on foot was a very, very difficult enterprise for anybody. These people are attempting to cross the river. You can see it down at the bottom of the slide on a cable, which is running across there's only one cable there, but there are ropes pulling the T-bar across that cable. It's a rather precarious enterprise. Then there's the dugout canoe, tippy dugout canoe. And then, of course, there's always walking. This is problematic, though, when the river is high, which is to say people sometimes try it when the river is high, and it's led to I've lost some friends this way. So all of this is happening. You've got this invasion, well, you can call it an invasion, migration of mestizos into this region, but it's not as if they're moving into an empty region. They're moving into a region that's already populated by Amerindians, in particular, people who are referred to as Schwar, okay? And the Schwar lived, at least in the 19th century and early 20th century, in fairly isolated homesteads. And this complicated their attempts to resist the encroachment by mestizos arriving in the region. So you did have acculturated Schwar who grew up around missions, Catholic missions usually, run by Salesians. And so what happens is that by the mid-1960s, you have a full-fledged competition between Schwar and between arriving mestizo migrants. And they're competing with one another for access to the lands. Correct. In other words, most of them are coming from small villages in the Andes, and they've been farming corn in that setting. But most of them come out there with the idea of starting a small-scale cattle ranch. Okay, but what happens is, and so the mestizos are taking lands away from this fairly disorganized Schwar, and what happens is that the Salesian priests attempt to reorganize Schwar society to better resist the incursions of these mestizo migrants. And this is it's really a mixed bag, because what happens is that the Salesians succeed in getting the Schwar to buying into a new settlement pattern, and you can see it here in this particular slide. So you'll see over here on the end, and they succeed in getting it at least when the political winds are blowing in their favor. So, and the Schwar become very adept at doing this. So by the end of the 1980s, they have largely secured their land base in the face of an invasion from mestizos. So in that sense, it's a fairly unusual circumstance. So if you look at this particular map, what you see here, these darker areas are Schwar lands. These are lands that the Schwar have legal title to, but it's a collective title, meaning that a group of Schwar have a title to an area of 3,000 to 5,000 hectares of land around this little village, Centro, that they formed. And the Schwar are not to leave an economic opportunity unexploited. They have been moving towards roads. So there are linear settlements of Schwar that have been developing over the past couple of decades. The final thing that the Schwar have done, along with the mestizos, is they have gotten into cattle ranching. And they've done this as a device to basically secure title to land. In other words, if they cleared a fairly good portion of the land, the likelihood that the government will approve their title, in this case global title, is higher than it would if the land were just in forest. And so for that reason, Schwar, as well as mestizos, become cattle ranchers. And so what you end up with is a landscape that is populated by lots of cattle pastures, as is true really actually throughout the Amazon, with the possible exception of the soy belt in Mato Grosso. And so a typical scene in this particular area is a shot of a line of cows who are moving their way through this vegetation, eating pretty much everything in sight, and leaving behind a brown stubble, okay? Now this, what you're looking at here is an aerial photo of a slide taken in the late 1960s of a deforested area. Now if you look at this particular area, is sort of an environmental disaster, if you think about it. In other words, it's a monoculture, it's all the same cattle pasture. You see an occasional tree, people chop down the trees largely because of concerns that in a windstorm the trees would fall over and fall on cows and they would lose their investment. So it's a kind of a monoculture. There's a tremendous loss of biodiversity with the creation of these landscapes, and as well as a huge kind of how should I say it, amount of greenhouse gas emissions with the destruction of those forests. So environmentally, the creation of these landscapes really is something of a disaster. So, but this is what it looks like in the late 1960s. Here's what a similar kind of an aerial photograph looks like in the 2010s, okay? So the couple things to note here. First of all, you can see that brown splotchy area where the cows have eaten their way through the green stuff, and that's the brown stubble that we were talking about just a minute ago. But if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you can notice there that there's this bunch of trees growing in these pastures. So tree density in these pastures is markedly higher than it was in this particular kind of pasture. And that's the particular story I want to spend some time talking about. So here's another shot of one of these landscapes, circa 2010. These guys think I have some salt, so they're coming in my direction. These are big animals, let me tell you. But you can see the trees here, okay? It's a silvopastoral kind of landscape. This is another example of a silvopasture. You might say, God, this doesn't look like a pasture to me. Well, it sort of is. Okay, another shot of one of these silvopastures. And so, but there's a variation between places, between farms. Some have few trees. Some farms have pastures with few trees, and other farms have pastures with lots of trees. And so the question is, why some places but not others? So the pastures are becoming silvopastures, that's pretty clear. But, and environmentally, this is actually good news. Well, both environmentally and economically, this is good news. In other words, it's a win-win kind of circumstance. In other words, what's happening here is that as the trees grow in the pastures, carbon is being sequestered, the biodiversity is increasing. But the other thing that's happening is that these trees are, after 10 to 15 years, marketable in local sawmills. So it's creating also a stream of income for the owners of these lands. But the crucial thing to note here is that this sort of pattern, this sort of story, only applies to certain farms and not to others. They're not planted. They regenerate spontaneously because it rains so much. So every time you go through to clean those pastures out after the cows have been through, you have to either suppress those trees, these seedlings, or by working at them with your machete, or you let them grow, in which case they begin to shade the pasture. But the interesting thing is that the pasture grasses here are shade tolerant. So the stocking rates for cows do not go down when these trees grow up. So it really is, in that respect, a win-win kind of circumstance, but it doesn't apply to all the cattle ranchers. And so the other thing to note, of course, is that secondary forests in the tropics are the most fearsome kind of carbon sequesterers of all the landscapes in the world. In other words, if you want to sequester a whole lot of carbon as quickly as possible, this is the negative emissions scenario. The secondary forests in the tropics are probably the way to do it. Trying to figure out why it is that some pastures, some farms are allowing this kind of stuff to occur and other farms are not. Well, one way to do that is to look at this series of cross-sectional surveys with household heads that we did over a 30-year or 25-year period. And this last time we did it, not only did we interview the owners of these lands, but we also did some work in the fields, actually measuring the amounts of carbon being sequestered. Okay, so the other thing that's really worth noting here is this is stem densities. This is the number of trees that are sprouting in these fields. And the point to note here is that there's big differences in stem densities between owner-occupied lands and renter-occupied lands. And the reason for that is that renters treat these sprouting trees differently than do owners. Renters only have 12-month contracts. So when they go through and clean out these pastures after the cows have been through it, they cut down all those little seedlings because they're going to get in the way of the next crop of pasture grasses. So they don't want any of these seedlings. If it's an owner-occupied land, they'll look at those tree seedlings coming up, and if it's a cedar or something like that that's valuable economically, they'll leave it. They'll say, yeah, we want that to grow because 10 years from now, I can sell that to a sawmill for a fairly considerable sum of money. And so what happens is that in these owner-occupied areas, these trees grow up, and they drop litter, which fertilizes the soils. They protect water sources, which are good for the cows. And so over time, you get these silvopastoral kinds of pastures emerging, and which again provide environmental benefits, but also economic benefits. But only in the owner-occupied areas. If they have to rent the lands out, that pattern is going to end up impoverishing the lands over time. And if you actually want to quantify this, we actually measure the amount of carbon coming out of these silvopastures and compare them with the pastures. There's about a ton per year per hectare of additional carbon being sequestered in these trees in these pastures with trees. And that translates at current carbon prices per ton to about 12 to 14 bucks a hectare per year. So if you're making $4,000 or $5,000 a year, which is the average income in this area, you could, and you have 20 hectares of land, you could get about $300 a year through payments for carbon sequestration. So it's not trivial. But then the question is, okay, so why these different trajectories among Schwar and mestizos? And what it boils down to is the fact that the Schwar have these collective land titles, and that at the same time, Schwar lands cannot be sold to non-Schwar. So if you're a bank, a regular bank, you want to repossess land that from a Schwar who took out a loan but then didn't pay it back, you cannot do that. So the banks will not loan to the Schwar. So all of a sudden, when a globalization occurs, people have to sell off their stocks of cows just to make ends meet because of price changes. Argentine beef arrives and the price of Ecuadorian beef goes down dramatically. And that people liquidate their stocks of cows. And when they want to repopulate their stocks of cows, the mestizos can do that because they can go to the bank to take out a loan to buy new cows. The Schwar can't do that. They have no source of credit. And so the mestizos, they can bounce back from an event like the arrival of the Argentine beef. The Schwar cannot do that. Their only source of income becomes renting out those pastures to usually mestizos who've got cows to spare. And so what happens is the Schwar get caught up in what could be construed as a poverty trap, meaning that their chief source of income is the rentals from renting out the land that they control, usually to mestizos. But the point is that process of pasturing cows and cutting down all the seedlings ends up impoverishing the soils over time. So they're getting their source of income is slowly dribbling away with the fertility of those pastures. That's what one would call a poverty trap, a natural resource degrading poverty trap. So they're sort of stuck. But by the same token, there is some opportunity there for the mestizos, the people who are allowing these silvopastures to be created. If somebody would create an NGO that could actually end up paying them for the carbon sequestration, there's the prospect of some considerable gains there for the mestizos, but not, unfortunately, for the Schwar. And the globalization episodes, like the arrival of the Argentine beef, that ends up kind of reinforcing this kind of inequality between the Schwar on the one hand and the mestizos on the other hand. A difference in tenure that wasn't significant back in the 1980s becomes quite significant in this period of globalization because it means that one group has credit or can get credit and the other group cannot. So there are ideas certainly for helping the Schwar. Education, Schwar, to a degree that is amazing to me, the Schwar have taken to things like higher education. And this works for Schwar women as well as Schwar men. So there are Schwar going to college now in ways that were not imaginable 30 years ago. There are things like low-input sugarcane coming actually from Cuba that has been picked up, and because it is low input, it means you don't need much capital to grow it. So there's the prospect that that could at least become somewhat lucrative for on some of these Schwar lands. There are truck gardens for cities, growing things like papachina or yucca, or plantains for cities. That's certainly, with the growth in the urban markets, something the Schwar are getting into to somewhat greater degree. And then there's boutique cattle ranching. Well, this is mostly what mestizos are doing, but there's that possibility as well. In other words, you don't have a lot of land, but you kind of try to capitalize on a superior breed, and it's, of course, grass-fed beef, which is which gets you a slightly higher price than if it's grain-fed beef. So there's that sort of prospect as well. So there is the possibility of a payments for carbon sequestration. It is only a possibility right now. There isn't an organization, there aren't organizations actively pushing this. But in addition, even if there were, it wouldn't help the poorest of the poor, and it wouldn't help the Schwar. So there would be more silvopastoral landscapes, there would be more carbon sequestration, which would certainly be good, and it would be, in that respect, a kind of sustainable development. And finally, there isn't a centrally organized set of organizations that are actually trying to do things to address the needs of the Schwar or the needs of the mestizo. In other words, the state is relatively inactive, meaning that places like this part of Ecuador, conceivably Rondônia, Acre, they really represent what would be construed as rural backwaters. In other words, places where significant government efforts are not present right now. And as long as that's the case, these are just ideas. They don't, they're not real in some fundamental respect. Without some sort of impetus from outside, it seems as though that's the case. I guess, let me just sort of say in brief, I think this sort of thing applies reasonably well to other populous frontiers, this sort of dynamic, meaning places like Rondônia, places like Acre. But
thank you, Tom. If I hear you correctly, sustainable development is in the hands of the mestizos. It's private.
In this particular setting, that's true. I guess the Schwar are caught entrapped, really, to some degree. Well, they had to get the land base. The land base without access to capital proved not to be as economically significant as people probably thought in the 1970s. Without access to capital, they've been hamstrung. Yeah.
What about microcredit or access to kind of non-traditional, non-bank forms of credit?
Yeah. It's not available. See, this comes back to the rural backwater notion. These settings are, it's easy. We can talk about microcredit in this kind of circumstance, but somebody actually has to deliver it on the ground, and there isn't a strong kind of NGO presence in these sorts of settings, and for a variety of reasons, I think.
So it's probably not very cost effective, and they can't go out and have a field office that would cover that.
Right. The NGOs probably have a reasonable explanation for it, and it probably has to do with a lack of financing, a lack of a robust kind of economic basis for delivering those sorts of services. But the absence, it's back to that rural backwater sort of circumstance. These places are lower priority politically.
As I understand it, in Latin America, there's a huge kind of, not just NGO presence in microfinance, but also for-profit, traditional for-profit banks or lots of lending, right?
Right. But the first question I would ask is, what's the rural-urban distribution of those opportunities? And at least in Ecuador, there's certainly in urban settings, there's lots of, well, there tends to be a lot more credit available than in rural settings, especially when you've got a circumstance like the 10-year circumstance with the Schwar that cuts off a significant source of credit. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think those are good points. I guess the other thing is that I would say that, and this is actually, Korea's government it's a center-left government. They focused on delivering a somewhat different set of goods, and arguably it's a defensible focus. So in other words, the first thing that they were primarily concerned with was improving the road network. And so they did a lot of paving of roads, blasting of tunnels through rock, and produced some significant achievements. The other thing that they did was they made Wi-Fi available in every school in Ecuador. So in many respects, their priorities weren't the sort of ones that I'm talking about, focused on small farmers.
That does not include, if I understand correctly, Schwar.
It's true that, no, I think probably it does include the Schwar. The Schwar schools.
In terms of the Wi-Fi and the communication.
I think it probably does. I think it probably does. Yeah.
Going back to the first question, talking about the lack of finance on the field for the Schwar. I was reminded of the Ecuador Bank in Mexico back during the days of the early agrarian reform. And I'm wondering, did the Ecuador Bank work to provide capital to collectively owned land? And is that some kind of a parallel that might be used if somebody got energized on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It kind of builds on that.
When you leave and have your microphone again.
Yeah, sorry. The important thing, I guess, in terms of this particular history was that the Salesian priests tried to create a kind of an ejido bank-like structure for financing, helping the Schwar with the financing, because they recognized the problem with the banks and banks lending to the Schwar. The difficulty is that the Schwar, the Salesians weren't able to capitalize their bank, which was like an ejido bank, at a sufficient level to make it a real force in terms of helping the Schwar get credit. And so it's kind of fell by the wayside after about 10 to 15 years, 10 to 12 years of operation. But it's a good idea. They just, part of the problem was that the Salesians were trying to do this, which reflects on their whole mixed legacy to some degree. But, you know, the fact that the government wasn't part of it, that it was set up in competition with the government, that caused problems.
Tom, the Amazon Basin, the rainforest, the selva, what percent of Ecuador's land are we talking about?
That remains in forest?
1/4?
No, that remains in forest?
The rainforest.
It's probably on the order of 45%.
45%.
Right. So the area farther, I mean, Ecuador has a fairly large preserved area, and that preserved area is largely used to extract oil, at least in terms of economic activity. And so the forests in those zones are relatively intact. This is like the Yasuni forest up near the Rio Napo, south bank of the Rio Napo. And the eastern portions of Morona and Santiago also have a relatively intact forest. The one thing that's unusual and, you know, doesn't bode well for the forest is the fact that the Schwar population actually continues to grow at a fairly rapid rate, and they continue to convert lands from forest into cattle pasture, and so you know, there is deforestation in dribs and drabs in that sense.
Tom, in terms of the other question, what percent of the rainforest, the Amazon Basin, if you will, is represented by Ecuador's share?
Small. So something on the order probably of certainly less than 6 or 7%.
Yeah, the big user is Brazil.
Right.
70 or 75%.
Right.
You know this, you know? Brazil accounts for what percent of the rainforest, the Amazon Basin?
All the Hispanic-speaking countries, they have about a little bit less than half of the existing rainforest. So that's Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, compared to Brazil. So there's that rough sort of split.
But the Amazon Basin, as he points out, is a big part of these countries. I mean, Colombia is 35%.
Yeah, that's right.
And Peru is
That's
also a big part, right? 40%.
Right.
One of the big shares of the Amazon Basin. It's all one system, right?
But the other thing is that this is not the kind of corporate frontier, which is the soy frontier that you've been talking about. So this is what we're talking about here is a dynamic that might apply to the populous frontiers in Brazil, but not to the corporate frontiers. So in other words, the data points on soils, on carbon, on stem density, all comes from a point-in-time survey, cross-sectional survey, done in 2011 and 12. And so what we've tried to do is using, this is tricky analytically, but it was the only way we could operate, was to look at stem densities and the size of the stems and try to figure out whether or not over time there was an increase in stem density based on the cross-sectional differences in stem density and the types of stems from farm to farm. So in other words, if it turned out that the highest stem densities were always small stems, okay, then that inclined us to think, well, this is there's a recency effect going on here, and meaning that this business of leaving stems is something that's only been recently adopted. Okay, that particular pattern in the data is consistent with that particular kind of story, but it's sort of dicey. I mean, in other words, what we don't have is stem density and soil quality data in a systematic sort of way from the same farms from 15 years earlier.
But wouldn't the stem density vary according to species?
I don't. Well, yeah, but the thing is, you're talking about frequency. We're not talking about the size, their size, to some degree. When we are talking about differences in size, we're talking about pretty large differences in size, meaning trees that are 10 meters high as opposed to trees that are 2 meters high. I mean, it is dicey, and it is a weakness in the whole program of research. But the difficulty was we couldn't go back and collect data from 2000. Yeah. So one of the interesting things is the fertility rates amongst the mestizos went down dramatically in the 1980s, and they went down dramatically amongst the Schwar in the early 1990s. And you know, we didn't investigate that. It would be politically probably hard to do. I mean, there's a whole set of challenges here with regard to carrying out interviews among Schwar and mestizos at the same time, because they don't like one another, but nonetheless. So there was a fairly significant decline in fertility that occurred in the 80s amongst the mestizos and in the 90s amongst the Schwar. They didn't reach replacement levels, but they declined rather dramatically, which leads me to think that it's probably not an important driver now, 20 years later, of the kinds of changes that we're talking about. It was a driver in terms of subdivision, but only because the Schwar stayed at home. A little bit later. Yeah, that's true. That is true. So it did play a role in the subdivision pattern that we talked about. Whether it will continue to play a role, given the fact that the fertility rates haven't rebounded, I guess I'm a little skeptical about that. But I think all of the above. I mean, I think the quick answer is, first of all, Spanish-speaking ability certainly has spread tremendously. I mean, when I first started working there as a Peace Corps volunteer a zillion years ago, you couldn't speak to Schwar women because they didn't speak Spanish. I mean, I couldn't because I didn't speak Schwar. And that's certainly no longer the case. And that, yeah, but it's also true that there is discrimination. I mean, in other words, there are Schwar and mestizos don't work well in a taxi co-op, for instance, so they have their own separate taxi co-ops. That kind of, so there is friction. And for instance, when a killing occurs, a cross-racial killing, the amount of fear, I mean, you can just feel it. It's palpable for the next couple of weeks. It's well, in the prosecution of the particular crime, yes, but the point is that the fear is attributable to a long history of conflict and a concern that it will break out again. So I think some of that plays a role in the reluctance to move to cities. But others would disagree with me and say, yeah, no, look, Amerindians in Latin America are moving to cities. The Schwar are doing that as well. I haven't seen a lot of evidence. We see evidence in our data of something else, meaning staying at home.
What is the, yeah, Larry, before you.
It's a good question. I don't know. Off the top of my head, we hired a Schwar. We couldn't have done this research had we not had Schwar on the working for us, because Schwar don't want to be interviewed by mestizos, and much less gringos. I mean, so but it's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it. It's the higher education is relatively recent. So as of the late 1990s, I think there was only like 1 or 2 college graduates who were Schwar. Now there are many more. And they're also women. So basically the carbon gets sequestered 2 ways, in the trees, but also below ground in the roots. And so if you're measuring it, you basically have to measure the below ground and the above ground. And the above ground's pretty easy to do. You just sort of visualize it and multiply away. The below ground, you actually have to take the dirt and separate out the roots from the dirt, and then weigh the roots, and then again extrapolate away. So that's how you actually measure the carbon sequestration going on in a particular piece of land. And then you summarize to get it to the per hectare basis. You have to again extrapolate. So you get to a tonnage, and then look at the value of it per ton to calculate the benefits that might come to a farmer, a landowner. Yeah, not really. I mean, it probably does affect the air quality in a positive sort of way, but I mean, that's the argument about trees more generally. But we were just thinking about it in terms of the actual economic impact of a carbon sequestration, payments for the carbon sequestration, because we were trying to incentivize some NGO to do this. It hasn't happened yet, but so as I understand it, I mean, so first of all, so when you chop down a tropical rainforest, most of the organic matter gets vaporized over time. In other words, and when that happens, then the greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere, and so then that's what accounts for the fairly large emissions that are associated with the destruction of old-growth tropical forests, and so that leaves you with the laterite. That's right. But the other point about it, and this is the point I was trying to make when I talked about secondary forests in the tropics, is growth is very rapid. Relatively rapid, and in part it has to be due to the climate. I mean, the fact all the rainfall in particular, and it's rapid, and in that the rapid rate of regrowth means fairly rapid uptake of CO2. It's a very good point, and I think you're right. There's a lot more diversity in terms of soil types and in terms of regeneration abilities than is generally. Yeah, but I think it's a fairly variable process, as you're suggesting. And the one thing that surprised me was that, you know, if you read way back when, Betty Megger's Amazonia Counterfeit Paradise, the implicit kind of notion or understanding you got was, oh my God, it's just a red desert, that if you get rid of the rainforest, it'll be gone forever. And that just doesn't seem accurate. At least it hasn't been borne out. Yeah, it's conceivable. I mean, the other thing is that it may be a place-specific effect. I mean, because we're right up against the edge of the Andes, so there's a lot of volcanic material that may enrich the soils and lead to this rather vigorous regrowth, in addition to all the rain. So, it means the generalizability of what we've done here is certainly open to question in those terms.
Can you tell us a bit about your own research in Ecuador? Can you tell us how did you do research in that area?
Well, I sort of did it a little bit in passing, but I mean, it's hard to, it's difficult to do research in a place where there's two groups who are locked in conflict. So one of the things that we had to do and was difficult was making certain that the research team was politic. In other words, so that we had representatives of both groups working with us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to we had to do a study that incorporated both the Schwar and the mestizos, because you just can't study half the story. But what this meant was being pretty politic in terms of deciding how to put together the research team. The first time, because amongst other things, the Schwar politicians are hostile to gringos, hostile to members of the larger society. Right, anybody who's an outsider. So the only way I was able to continue with this work was to make sure that I had people sort of on the inside working for the project, which...
How many years was that?
Well, we did 3 waves of research, but
3 waves of research?
Beginning in the mid-'80s through the last data collection effort was 2014.
It's a very long-term research.
Yeah, and it helped that we were pretty much what we said we were, meaning that what we said about the first time was pretty much what we did. And
have you been able to recruit students to continue that kind of research?
Not really, no. It's pretty, gets back to the remoteness of the place. It's tough. It's just not...
NGOs, are they very active?
No.
They're not very active either.
Yeah, it's a long way. It goes back to the point that several of you made about the remoteness of the area. It's just... and the hostility, you're right. Oh, very much so. In fact, they've participated in national politics.
How is that working out vis-a-vis the local conflict?
Well, the problem is that there isn't a good pass-through from what the Schwar are doing on the national level to what the Schwar are doing at the local level. So some of the villages don't see much in the way of benefits from the positions that the Schwar take in the national government. And the government has been they're sort of, they've taken a hard position, as you might understand, with regard to revenues from oil and mines and things of that sort. And oftentimes the Schwar are on the other side of that, the local Schwar are on the other side of that argument. And the government has not, by and large, aided the Schwar in that respect. They've been opposed to them. Mm-hmm. So the one thing about slash and rot in this particular setting is, so what that means is that you cannot burn the landscape because it rains so much. So one of the traditional means of fertilizing gets back to the point you were raising, which is, okay, bring the vegetation down to the soils by burning it, and then, taking that burst of productivity that comes with the burning and producing a crop. That's not really operative in this sort of setting. Instead, what you almost get, I think, is a lot of leaching from all the rainfall, which would exacerbate the sort of thing you were talking about earlier. But again, there's variations in soils from locale to locale, and it could well be because this is so close to the edge of the Amazon basin that it's not typical of areas farther into the basin.
What would be the biggest threat to the Amazon basin? Well, let me preface that question with another unanswerable question. Where is the basin going, the Amazon basin? What's going to happen to it? given trends from where you walk from Ecuador,
Yeah, I guess.
and given your other work on the rainforest. Is it really threatened that much as many of us fear?
My guess is that the threats are not going to go away, meaning that, and some of it comes back to the question you were asking about population. What will happen to Amerindian populations? What will they do with the land? At least in the case of the Schwar, if the fertility rates stay low, then maybe that won't be as much of a factor. The other issue is what happens to commodities booms. Commodity booms have, the commodity prices have tanked largely. That hasn't slowed down the deforestation rate Brazil's rate of deforestation slowed down, but largely due to more efficient enforcement procedures. The thing that hasn't happened is that in the last couple of years, commodity prices went down, but the deforestation rates didn't follow them down. So it's hard to see what's going on there. If anything, the deforestation rates have increased over the last couple of years, perhaps because there's more clearing of land for soy. So the dynamics of the soy market may play a larger role in this deforestation process than, for instance, the population changes amongst Amerindians. Yeah, yeah. But the other thing about the Schwar is they're sort of like people from New Jersey. They like to refer to themselves as a complaining society. So in other words, they are fairly individualistic, and which means, amongst other things, that what one finds in Schwar villages is there are big men who run their own families, supra families, and other households that are not able to kind of get it together and therefore don't accumulate wealth on a household basis. And so you get this kind of individualized process. It's a little, I don't want to say mafiosi, but the point being that some households have more influence than other households. Within the collective title, yes. So in other words, there'll be you can as a householder get make certain that the piece of land that you've been assigned can be inherited by your children. And so there are these accumulation strategies that occur within the collective title, but that doesn't help your creditability, your credit worthiness in the face of a bank. Right, right. But it's also for who can purchase cows. So there's people with the levels of inequality in terms of holding cows. They have spiked amongst both mestizos and amongst Schwar. And it's the same sort of thing I think that drives inequality here.
Well, again, this is part of a whole entire set of discussions we have organized and will continue to organize with the participation of many of us, of you and others, on the Amazon Basin. We showed in the summer that movie, what was it called? La abrazo a serpiente, the embrace of the serpent. Many of us, are you familiar? And we want to show it again. We recommend that because we want to get a discussion on the larger historical, cultural, ecological problematics of the Amazon Basin. It's a whole world out there, right? And we invite you to give us ideas how to do that. Just a brief comment on soy in Brazil, and I was going to do a presentation, but this is so rich that I don't want to take away from your from your presentation. But so of course it's a very opposite story. Very good contrast is a big soy, big commodities, as you pointed out. Everything is big in Brazil, big farms, capitalized, connections to infrastructure projects that are being developed as we speak, railroads. The one that I would address for you, maybe we can do that some other time, is the development of transportation system in the Amazon River the hidrovías, no? Waterways through the rivers, the Madeira, the Tapajós, and the other rivers. Those are the main two ones closer to the rainforest. And they are really, the story there is very simple, which is that, yes, it was a cerrado story up until, I would say, 4 years ago or 5, but it's been encroaching into areas such as the one you described there. So I do not know the amount of land that has been cleared but it's substantial in that area, right, for soy. Very substantial and growing. So the state of Pará, for instance, becoming a major, not a major, but a substantial producer. Mato Grosso we used to think of Mato Grosso as part of the Amazon, right? Amazonía legal, as they say in Brazil. Well, the Mato Grosso is now almost uniformly, except for, well, much of the Amazon, the Mato Grosso is soy and grains and commodities. Big producers, big traders financing water companies to transport the soy and grains and cattle to the Amazon, out to the ocean. So that whole world is changing in major ways, and that's something we want to do. I'm making a comment contrasting the many ways in which the Amazon basin is being changed and perhaps threatened. And they all have to do with the concept of sustainable development, right? I mean, do we have something viable, or are we talking about a model that is destroying the Amazon? I don't have an answer, but it's certainly a major issue. Many Brazilians maintain that it's inevitable to develop that part of Brazil for development purposes. Just sitting there is a major resource. I tend to agree with some of that, actually. But that it does pose a threat to waters, to natives, to plants, to you name it, right? So again, big models. So we thank you for describing and analyzing what is happening in one part of this. Small part. Of this, no, it's not. I say very important part, as you pointed out, because it applies to parts of Brazil, and perhaps to Colombia and to Peru as well as Baba. I don't know about Bolivia, you know.
So the one thing I was going to say, and this is actually, it's a challenge to all of us, is that if you have to think about deforestation rates in the Amazon basin, the one thing that's striking over the last 12 to 14 years is the degree to which Brazil diverges from the Hispanic republics, meaning that the deforestation rates are considerably higher in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela taken together than they are in Brazil. And this may have to do with the posture of the state being more aggressive in Brazil than elsewhere, but honestly, I'm not sure.
Oh, this was happening with Gilma as well. It's been happening throughout the whole, that's the reason Marina has stepped out of the coalition. So it's a broader issue, broader tendency. I have a question for you that I meant to ask. Do we have anything close to a concept of sustainable development? Do we really agree on what sustainable development is?
Probably should have.
We do?
At the outset. Well, the triangular one is the one that I like the best. Equity, economics, and environment. That's the classic kind of critical triangle of sustainable development.
Very good. So we go back to those issues. And we did not discuss other issues like the various struggles, various movements for defending the rainforest. We will have to do that some other time.